Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this lecture in the series of Philosophy of Science in Economics. This is lecture 20. This is the 20th lecture, and the 20th lecture will handle issues that relate to truth. And if you recall from lecture 16, 17, 18, and 19, we did look at truth as a central problem of philosophy. And if you recall, in lecture 19, I did take you through classical theories of truth, but we did cover a preliminary map. We went to correspondence theory. In this lecture, I want to take you through the coherence theory and the verification theory. And then possibly in our lecture 21, we shall look at pragmatism and the identity theory, ladies and gentlemen. Now, since we are dealing with the issue of the theories of truth, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take you through the coherence theory. And I want to start by saying that the difficulties of articulating the relationship between truth and reality invite the following consideration. Now, if any attempt to spell out the structure of facts brings us back to the structure of our thoughts and of the sentences that we use to express them, then we ask ourselves a question: can there be a reality that would be independent from our judgments and of our interpretations? Now, if you recall, in the lecture 19, we did look at the correspondence theory. And in the correspondence, our interest was to try and look at the thoughts and ideas of individuals and match those thoughts and ideas to the reality out there and the facts. And I did present arguments from various philosophers and various scholars. Now, when we come to the coherence theory, ladies and gentlemen, we are asking ourselves a fundamental question: can there be a reality that will be independent from our judgments and our interpretation? Now, of course, when we ask a question like that, it leads us to a familiar idea. To see a situation as a fact is to judge and interpret it. The moment you start talking about facts, right, and you're looking at situations and looking at those situations as a fact is to try and make judgment and produce interpretations of those particular situations, and our conceptual powers permeate and condition our experiences, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if the facts of, if we take that word of, if the facts of the world cannot be articulated apart from the way we structure the world, we have a fundamental question: how can we tell what they are apart from a perspective from within our thoughts? Now, when one's judgment confronts experience, ladies and gentlemen, one does not reach reality itself, but further judgments and further beliefs and further statements. Now, this, of course, invites a form of idealism or anti-realism as against the realistic picture that has driven us so far, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if this idealism is not to be a mere form of the Pythagorean relativism or a Bakerian subjective idealism, it must say how truth can be an objective feature. Otherwise, we'll have a problem, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this can be provided perhaps by defining truth as a different sort of relation from the correspondence theory that we saw a few minutes ago. And here, we'll only be looking at the definition of theory in terms of a relation of coherence, and that's why we're talking about the coherence theory. Now, this leads us to the coherence theory of truth, ladies and gentlemen. And in the coherence theory of truth, a thought, a belief, or a statement is true if and only if it appropriately belongs to a coherent set of propositions, beliefs, and statements, ladies and gentlemen. So we can't describe this mathematically as we did in the correspondence theory. Mathematically, I'm sure you can see this on the screen here. Coherence, right? When we are dealing with the coherence theory, right, X is true if and only if X approximately belongs to a coherent set of S, where now S is meant to be a set of entities of the same kind as X. So we are dealing with the issues of coherence. Remember, we had the correspondence, now we are dealing with the coherence. So that coherence theory certainly applies, right, where we have the subject or the element, right, or an aspect that we call X, right, and that X in this case is true, right, and if and only if that X appropriately belongs to a coherent set of S, where your S is meant to be a set of entities of the same kind. Now, if you recall in the correspondence theorem, right, initially when we were discussing the correspondence theory, we did say, right, that if you have a proposition P, and P can be an idea, P can be a thought. Now, that idea or thought, right, must certainly correspond to the reality out there or must correspond to facts. And that's the kind of puzzle that we have been discussing. Now, in the coherence theory, the situation is a little bit different because we are saying coherence here, X, right, your value of in the coherence theory, X, right, is true if and only if X appropriately belongs to a coherent set of X, set S, where of course set is meant to be a set of entities of the same kind as X. Now, in this case, ladies and gentlemen, it is important to add here the adverb appropriately. Now, in order to dispel an obvious objection that is likely to come up, especially when people want to dismiss the coherence theory. Now, if one understands coherence, ladies and gentlemen, in the minimal sense of the non-contradiction between a set of statements or beliefs, it is clear that a lot of such sets will pass the test, ladies and gentlemen, which may nevertheless contain a lot of intuitively false beliefs. Actually, any otherwise coherent fictional story may contain non-contradictory but false beliefs. So coherence alone, as you can see, again has come under fire in the recent past, especially when you are discussing issues of truth, right? And these are the issues that we are going to discuss in this lecture. And of course, you will discover at the end of the day that most of the theories that have been put forward to explain the concept of truth have also come under attack. And of course, that is very important. So moreover, if we're going to bring in the issue of coherence, ladies and gentlemen, any coherent set of beliefs can be made more coherent by adding to it one or more false beliefs. And there can be rival and divergent belief systems that are all internally coherent, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, whenever I bring out these theories of truth, I refer you back to the definition that we had, the definition for knowledge, because we know what knowledge is, right? And knowledge is defined as justified true beliefs. So we looked at issues of beliefs, right? I also did talk about issues of justification, and now we have brought in the issue of truth. So knowledge is justified true belief, JTF, and those are the issues that we are discussing now. And of course, it is very important because we are saying under coherence, right? If you're talking about a coherent set of beliefs, right, and these they can be made more coherent by adding to those particular beliefs one or more false beliefs. So you can have false beliefs at the end of the day. And there can be rival and divergent belief systems that are all internally coherent. So the issue of coherence is also questionable, as you can see. Now, this is the objection that Russell addressed to the coherence theory, ladies and gentlemen. And Russell, in this case, comes up, and is one of those philosophers, and says, the proposition, right, that Bishop Stubbs was hanged for murder is false, but it can become true if it is included in a sufficiently coherent and comprehensive set of other propositions. Now, the question is, which set? Right? Do we know that set of beliefs, ladies and gentlemen, where we can include some of these propositions? So these are the questions that come up, and then the other question will be, how can we determine it, right? How can we determine the set, right? First of all, the set, right? Which set are we talking about? The set of propositions, and how do we determine that set of propositions? Now, to this coherentists about truth, of course, they will answer that what they mean by coherence among a set of beliefs is that the beliefs must be in some sense controlled or justified by a certain criterion or pedigree that they share, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in this sense, as you can see, when we say that the beliefs of a single person or of a whole community are coherent, what is required is not that they should all be coherent, no, but that a wide majority of them be such true. Now, talk of a pedigree, a test or a criterion of coherence means that the coherence relations must be an epistemic one. Remember, you're talking about the epistemic relation. And in this sense, the coherence theory is an epistemic conception of truth, one that in some sense gives an explanation of the relation. And of course, here we are talking about issues that bring in the concept of appropriateness or appropriately, ladies and gentlemen. So for this reason, the relation in question will be a matter of degree, and it may also be in some sense context relative. Coherence theorists may take truth as coherence to depend upon the subject matter. So if you're talking about coherence, again, the issue of subject matter will come up. For instance, one might accept the view that moral truth as such in virtue of some sort of coherence, ladies and gentlemen, although this does not apply to empirical scientific truth, or that theoretical statements in science have to be coherent, in contrast with empirical statements. There can be such combinations, ladies and gentlemen, within the doctrine of a single philosopher. For instance, some of you have read the works of Immanuel Kant. For example, Kant holds some sort of coherence, right? And of course, the coherence view now, I mean, what do we see under this element of coherence? According to Immanuel Kant, right, you see that this coherence perspective will view for concepts or the categories of the understanding, whereas what he calls intuition or the deliverance of senses experience are not subject to such a criterion, ladies and gentlemen. So Kant comes up and holds some sort of coherence view for certain concepts or for the categories of the understanding. And of course, this is what he calls intuition, ladies and gentlemen. So such views would, however, hardly qualify as candidate for full-blown coherentism, but only as local versions of it, since they accept that truth could be understood in the correspondence sense in some regions. Now, of course, if you go to coherentism or coherence, the full-blown coherentism is a different kind of view in this perspective. It is the view that we can integrate into a maximally coherent whole larger and larger sets of beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. So you must come up with that set of beliefs so that in the end we reach complete system, ladies and gentlemen. So a first extension might involve the consideration not of our actual beliefs, but also of what we would believe in the future or in ideal circumstances. As probably Pierce, one of the scholars, would say, at the end of human inquiry. So, of course, when you're doing research, you are undertaking inquiries, but at the end of the day, we would believe, would have those particular beliefs that will take us into the future, right? So we are concerned with what we would believe in the future or in ideal circumstances, and that's what Pierce calls the end of human inquiry, ladies and gentlemen. So, but we might also extrapolate these ideas that we are discussing even more by supposing that the maximal coherent state is reached only within the beliefs of God or of an absolute mind. So if you're dealing with the coherence, at the end of the day, you'll be looking at maximal coherent state, and the maximal coherent state is reached only within the beliefs of God or of an absolute mind. So when we start talking about issues of truth, then you should view truth that way. Now, in this sense, ladies and gentlemen, the philosophers' views, such as the views of Spinoza's pantheistic monism, or Hegel's or Brade's absolute idealism, will be paradigm examples of full-blown coherentism. Let's also take another example. Let us suppose, for purposes of advancing our argument, that we want to understand this concept of idealization. I hope you remember our debate on modeling or models and modeling in economics, ladies and gentlemen, where we looked at the mathematical models and econometric models. That was from lecture 13, 14, and 15. I hope you still recall that. But let us suppose we could understand such idealizations, and that truth can only be predicated of beliefs integrated into such comprehensive wholes as nature, God, substance, or the absolute, ladies and gentlemen. Then, as Bradley, again another scholar, made clear, truth will never be predicated of a single belief in this case, but only of the absolute system, since no truth is ever a perfect truth. And I think that's one of the conclusions that we reached, especially after discussing that theory that we had, and that was the correspondence theory, if you remember. So here we are dealing with the theory of coherence. So we can even extend the same idea at the end of the day. And in this case, we are more or less concluding that our beliefs, apart from those about the absolute, ladies and gentlemen, are only conditionally true, or true only to a degree. So, and this is really, these ideas, again, that have been advanced by scholars. But again, you have the ideas that we saw from Frege, if you recall. And these are contrary to what Frege thought. So in this case, contrary to what Frege said, truth will be a matter of degree. But when we have reached the ideal state, ladies and gentlemen, how can we say that we have reached truth? And how can we know that? And if not, because at the end of the day, it is supposed to reflect or to correspond or to be identical with the whole of reality, ladies and gentlemen. Again, that takes us to the coherence theory, where we saw that, you know, the ideas and the thoughts that we have must correspond to reality out there, right? Or must correspond to facts. Now, coherence, again, we are saying that we must have this element of coherence among a set of certain beliefs that we have. So coherence is very important. So you must be able to identify that set S and, of course, the elements that are constituted in that particular set. So it is not clear here, ladies and gentlemen, the talk of an ideally coherent system does not collapse into the idea of an ideally corresponding system that is about reality, ladies and gentlemen. So neither is it clear that the system in question has to be mental or made of mind stuff, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why we go back to the arguments advanced by Spinoza Deus, Spinoza's Deus Sive Natura, or what he calls the nature according to the doctrines of emergentism of the end of the 19th century. And of course, you have fellows like Samuel Alexander, 1920, and all that was seen as an evolving system going from brute matter to a mind that will, in the end, be gods. And of course, all these were not taken as mental holes in this kind of thing. So the official coherentist view is that truth is a relation between thoughts. So in other words, we must get the set and those things that belong to that particular set. And if you're going to take the coherence kind of theory or perspective, then truth is a relation between thoughts. But it is very difficult for the coherentist, ladies and gentlemen, to avoid saying that when the appropriate test of coherence is met, the thoughts are simply true in the corresponding sense, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, we are thus led to suspect that far from defining truth, the coherence conception of truth as ideal or absolute justification of our beliefs actually presupposes the concept of truth. So, as you can see, although the coherentism perspective has often been associated with associated in the history of philosophy with the high-flown metaphysical doctrines of absolute idealism or monism in this case, there is no necessity in this, and there does seem to be an intuition at the root of the doctrine that is worth spelling out in this case, that a given belief is true only if it can be justified or warranted in a certain way, and that truth has an essential connection to knowledge. Remember, knowledge is justified through belief. So in this case, a given belief is true only if it can be justified or warranted in a certain way, that truth, right, and that truth has an essential connection to knowledge, as you can see. That takes us back to the original philosophical question of knowledge, and of course the nature of knowledge, the nature of understanding, and that was my lecture 1 and lecture 2. So the coherentist takes this justification to be tied not only to individual beliefs, ladies and gentlemen, but to systems of beliefs. Hence holds the view that knowledge is also a matter of coherence. And that's why some philosophers and researchers who undertake very big projects, at the end of the day, they really talk about issues of coherence, right? So systems that cohere, and of course knowledge that cohere, all that becomes very important. So the coherentist takes this justification to be tied not only to individual beliefs, ladies and gentlemen, but to systems of beliefs. And of course, that's why they hold that this view of knowledge is also a matter of coherence. But here again, I must say, it is not necessary, and there will be coherentists as well as non-coherent versions of epistemic theories of truth. So we talk about theories of truth, but it's very important for us to add the word epistemic, right? Because we are really talking about philosophical issues. The nature of knowledge becomes very important. Even when you are talking about truth, we are concerned with the nature of truth. That set, right, where you have certain elements that are related to one another in that perspective, ladies and gentlemen. So that gives us the coherence theory, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me at this mature time to take you to the verification theory, and that is our third. Remember, we started with the correspondence theory, right? We have gone through the coherence theory. Now we go to the verifications theory. And I want to say in this verifications theory that an epistemic theory of truth is one that essentially ties truth to our epistemic justification for beliefs. I know we have beliefs, and when we are defining knowledge, we define it in terms of justified true beliefs. That is true. Yes, we have beliefs, right? But those beliefs must have epistemic justification. We must provide epistemic justification for the beliefs. And of course, once we go through this, we'll understand that truth is a matter of whether a belief is justified, warranted, rational, accepted, and so on. So in this case, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see on the screen, I can give you a mathematical expression. The mathematical expression, roughly, as you can see here, is described this way, that the epistemic theory, in this case we are talking about the epistemic theory of knowledge, right, which must be justified, so we provide epistemic justification for those beliefs. So epistemic theory, right, comes into play when we say that X is true, right, if and only if X satisfies some epistemic condition, and that is the verification theory, ladies and gentlemen. So epistemic theory, of course, X is true if and only if X satisfied some epistemic condition. Now, in this sense, ladies and gentlemen, a definition of truth for such theories is inseparable from a criterion of truth. But it need not straightforwardly assimilate truth to justification. For one might have a criterion of truth without this criterion being a definition of truth itself. Thus, the catalog of a library gives us a criterion for the presence or the absence of a book in the library. But what we mean when we say that the book is in the library is not that the book is in the catalog, ladies and gentlemen. And that's a very nice example, right? If we take an example of a catalog of a library, and you know what a catalog of a library is, right? So when we go through that catalog of library, it's a criterion for the presence or the absence of a book in the library. But what we mean when we say that the book is in the library is not that the book is in the catalog, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see. And all these are certainly very topical questions. Now, if we take, for instance, Descartes, I hope you still remember, Descartes is one of the early philosophers. If we take Descartes' view, right, of course we know what that means, right? Now, his criterion for truth is self-evidence, or the clarity and distinctiveness of our ideas. But his official definition of truth is the adequacy of ideas with respect to things. Remember, when you are dealing with the correspondence theory, we did say that we have ideas and we have thoughts, and these must correspond to reality out there. Right, and of course the same idea has been given in the previous theory that we have just seen. Now, when we take these verification theories, and gentlemen, we start now interrogating issues, and the clarity and the distinctiveness of our ideas become very central, right? And of course, this is very important. And ladies and gentlemen, at this stage, another reason why truth does not simply amount to justification is that justification is a context relative and defeasible element. Now, if we take still an example which is related to the things that we've been doing in terms of modeling and so forth, justification is context relative and defeasible, as we said earlier on. One can have a justification for P at a certain time T, for instance, and in circumstances C. But this very element P, right, the truth for this element T can actually cease to be justified at a certain time T1 or T dash or T plus, and in circumstances C1 or C plus or C dash in this case. So the justification, ladies and gentlemen, must be in some sense stable and undefeasible. So we have seen that coherentism in this case, insofar as it defines the truth as the coherence of a set of beliefs constrained by an epistemic condition, qualifies as an epistemic theory of truth. That's what we've seen in the previous section. But the most common kind of epistemic theory of truth is verification, as I've just given you. And with verification, as you can see here, All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think I can show you this on the screen. And on the screen, I'm simply telling you that the most common kind of epistemic theory of truth is verificationism. And this verifications identifies the truth of a statement with its verifiability. That's why we are dealing with the issues of verificationism. So, in other words, when we say this is true, right, when we say that this constitutes the element called truth, we must be able to verify what we are talking about. So the verifications theory, as you can see, holds on this screen, as you can see, verificationism, X is true, right, if and only if X is verifiable, ladies and gentlemen. And this should not be confused with the verificationist theory of meaning. I'm not really talking about meanings in this case. We are talking about truth. So what we are verifying is truth. And of course, this is very important, because if you start talking about verification theory of meaning, this simply says that the meaning of a statement or sentence, right, is the method by which we verify it. So you come up, but that's not what I'm talking about. Now in this, and you can see that the possession of a method, for instance, ladies and gentlemen, that is checking one's memories for establishing the meaning of a certain sentence about the past, need not imply that such sentences are true when so verified. But there is a link between the first and the second. For when the method is conclusive and reliable, ladies and gentlemen, if memory were so reliable in this case, for instance, by giving us direct acquaintance with the past events, assuming that we can, the method of verification warrants the truth of the statement. Now, the link appears better in the other direction. If one equates the meaning of a sentence with its truth conditions, and the truth conditions are verification conditions, then one can move from a verification's conception of truth to a verificationist conception of meaning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the logical positivists tried to defend such verification conceptions of meaning and of truth in the 1930s on the basis of an empirist epistemology, according to which the meaning of a statement and its truth could be ascertained from its connections to experiences. Now, on this basis, as you can see, they drew a distinction between those statements that are true on the basis of our verifications by sense of experience. And this is what we call the synthetic, right? And they looked at this, they verified by sense of experience, especially those that are true purely in virtue of meaning and linguistic conventions alone. And this is what we call the analytic truth. So you have the synthetic and the analytic truth coming up in this perspective. Now, you can see here, notoriously, these accounts that we are discussing failed because of their reductionist character, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, when we talk about the reductionist character, the task of isolating purely empiricist criteria for the meaningfulness and truth of our belief is hopeless, as you can see. Now, as a number of critics have come up, especially critics of this empiricist conception, including logical positivism, such as Hempel, you remember Hempel, and Neurath, and in particular Quinn. We used the ideas of Quinn to discuss the correspondence theory. I hope you still remember that very well, right? Now, Quinn and others who have come up to critique the ideas of verifications in this perspective have shown that the meaning of an individual isolated statement or belief, and hence its truth, right, cannot be ascertained independently from a background of other statements, and thus cannot be reduced to basic empirical tests, ladies and gentlemen. So it's very important, again, in this case, as you can see, for us to know where we are. And here, we stumble again on a feature upon which the coherentist conception of truth insisted. And this is the holism, or the necessary network connected character of our beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. And in the philosophy of science, the problem for a verificationist conception of the truth of scientific theories is familiar. And in this case, rival and incompatible theories can predict exactly the same empirical consequences. And you're aware of that. And theories are determined by the possible evidence, ladies and gentlemen. So this leads to the view known as the Duhem-Quinn thesis, right? Remember, we are dealing with verification. You must be able to verify, right? And that bit of coherent set S must have element within that, and those elements are related to each other, and we must be able to verify the truth, ladies and gentlemen. So this leads us to the view known as the Duhem-Quinn thesis. And of course, the Duhem-Quinn thesis simply states that on the whole, theories meet experience and not isolated beliefs. Because if you are going to verify, just tell me the basis upon which you are going to verify certain things. Are you going to use your experience? Now, remember, experience at time t can vary. Just as I said earlier on, that reality can be complex, right? Now, in this room, right, if you are looking at the number of students who are gathered in this room, they are listening to this lecture, right? The kind of relationships between them are numerous and, of course, very complex in this case. So what happens at T, the interactions in the room at T, right, will be totally different from the interaction you get at T1 and the interaction you get at T2, T3, etc. And you can't really describe everything that you see here. So, of course, when we talk about the Duhem-Quinn thesis, right, we are saying, yes, that on the whole, theories that meet experience and not isolated beliefs in this case, and that appropriate adjustments can always be made to make them fit the data. So you should be able to verify this kind of thing. So even when you have the beliefs and so forth, you must be able to collect the data and do some bit of verification. Right, but even then, although you are going to collect that kind of data, right, your beliefs, right, will again influence the kind of data that you're going to collect and the kind of verification that you're going to have. So, but of course, you can see, again, this coherence theory of knowledge will stumble upon the difficulty that affects the coherence theory of truth, that one can always enlarge or modify our coherent sets of beliefs to adapt them to reality. And that's what happens. So when you go out, yes, you are trying to verify, but you can always enlarge, you can always modify, and you can always adapt. But in this case, perhaps we can save the basic insights of the verification's conception of meaning and truth without endorsing its most reductionist and coherentist sequences or consequences in this perspective. Now, this is what philosophers like Dermott, 1978, 1991, have tried to show. Now, if you look at the works of Dermott, ladies and gentlemen, Dermott's program aims at giving us a new framework for thinking about the issues that traditionally oppose in philosophy realism and anti-realism, ladies and gentlemen. So he claims that these issues do not concern so much the kind of entities that we can consider as real or not, but the kind of conception of truth that underlies our commitment. So realism and anti-realism are thus primarily the semantic thesis in this perspective. So Dermott actually starts from a reflection on the meaning and the truth of mathematical statements. And the view known as the Platonisms in the philosophy of mathematics simply says that they are true in virtue of some independent reality which will exist whether we are able to recognize it or not, ladies and gentlemen. So, as you can see from the Platonism perspective, not only embodies a realistic conception of truth, but also a realist conception of meaning. So the issue of truth comes in realist perspective, but there's also this realist perspective of meaning, according to which the meaning of mathematical statements transcends their possible verification, ladies and gentlemen. So the opposite view, which is the constructivism perspective, says that they do not transcend this verification and equates truth with the proof or demonstration. So there must be proof and there must be demonstration. For it, the meaning of a statement will be given by its assertability, or what we call proof of conditions, ladies and gentlemen. So Dermott's conception can be thought of as an attempt to extend this opposition from the mathematical case to the case of the meaning of other sorts of statements than mathematical ones, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, we are, at the end of the day, we shall be concerned with providing a theory of meaning for whole languages, which is not very easy, but again, would be based on constructivistic assumptions. These are issues that we did discuss earlier on. But if so, it would presuppose a certain conception of truth and meaning, instead of being an attempt to show on independent grounds such a conception is correct. So his considered view, of course I'm talking about Dermott, his considered view is rather that a verification theory of truth, ladies and gentlemen, can be established on the basis of verification theory of meaning. Now, to defend the latter, he argues that a language could not be learned, nor the meaning of its sentences be made manifest to others, if one could not associate with them specifiable assertion or conditions, or to take up the Wittgenstein's slogan that meaning is use, or probably use conditions in this case. So he claims that we have no conception of what various recognition transcendent sentences about the past, about the counterfactual circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, about remote regions of space and time could be, although we understand such sentences, hence that what we mean by such sentences cannot be their realistic truth conditions. So he is thus led to propose an anti-realist semantics in terms of assertability of conditions. And if we take that assertability of conditions, ladies and gentlemen, I want to show you an illustration here which is mathematical in nature and of course philosophy-oriented, as you can see, which is really a version of the verifications view in this sense. So when we go into what we call the warranted assertability, right? The warranted assertability perspective of the verifications theory of truth tells us that X in this perspective is true if and only if X is warrantedly assertable, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, as Dermott puts it in truth, right, we no longer explain the sense of statements by stipulating its truth value in terms of the truth values of its constituents, but by stipulating when it may be asserted in terms of the conditions under which its constituents may be asserted. And of course, those are the ideas that are put forward by Dermott. But such an epistemic or verifications theory of meaning will not leave untouched our ordinary conception of truth, because we also have our own perspectives, our own conceptions of truth. And this can be seen for the simple case of negation. And I'm going to give you another example. In the classical logic, ladies and gentlemen, if you say it is not true that P, right, and then you say and not P, right, it is not true that P and not P, in the classical logic, right, they have the same meaning, right? But if truth is warranted, assertability, and that's what I've just given on the screen here, warranted assertability, it simply means P means, right, it is assertable that P, and in this case our P is a proposition, remember, the ideas and the thoughts and the correspondence that we said, all those thoughts and ideas will correspond to certainly some kind of reality out there or facts. But in this case, right, one moment we add warranted assertability, P means it is assertable that P, and that's the proposition, and not P means it is not assertable that P. Right, but it is not assertable that P is not equivalent, right, to it is assertable that not P. And of course we need to be very careful here, because at the end of the day we pick things that make sense and we follow the language and the discipline. So at some point such an anti-realist semantics will have to reject or to suspend belief in, and of course that's the classical principle of bivalence, that every statement is either true or false. You know that very well. So it seems that a radically epistemic conception of meaning, ladies and gentlemen, will do more than give a definition of truth in terms of epistemic access, because we must be able to really access those particular constructs in terms of verifiability, right? But of course the issue of assertability of conditions becomes very important. Such a conception, ladies and gentlemen, embodies two problematic assumptions of truth in this case. The first is that one could give verification conditions one by one for each kind of sentences. In the light of the holistic character of verification, this is dubious, right? And the second is that a verification theory of meaning leads to a verification theory of truth, right? And truth is warranted assertability in this case. But warranted assertability is not truth, for this goes against our best realistic intuitions. It seems perfectly possible to have all the best justifications for the truth of a statement, although this statement might be false. So what is true may not coincide with what is known to be true, right? What is true does not coincide with what is known to be true. And that's where the verification theory has a problem also. Now, we have a very big question at in our minds that we must answer. Now, could we suppose that we can reach a stage where a statement or a set of statements, ladies and gentlemen, are such that they can completely be justified in an ideal situation? We have already seen that this idealization move is characteristic of the coherence theory of truth. But we have also seen at the same time that when it is supposed to imply that we reach the standpoint of an omniscient being or an absolute concentration and conception of reality, this conception is dubiously an anti-realist, or what we call epistemic conception of truth. And the ideal state in this case is better constructed as that of an ideal knower who would in relevant respects, ladies and gentlemen, be like us, but who would also in relevant respects be unlike us. I hope you still remember the Laplace scrutability theory when he talks about that particular individual who has information and sufficient intellect to process that information and be able to look into the future and tell us what is likely to happen. But of course, Putnam also comes to the fore with a kind of debate, and this is Putnam 1983, especially after peace, has once proposed such a view of truth as idealized rational acceptability, or what he calls warranted assertability, ladies and gentlemen. And in this case, a belief is true, and I'm going to show this on the screen. A belief is true if and only if it would be justifiable in a situation where all the relevant evidence were available. So for you to be able to verify something, right, and then you are bringing the issue of justification, justifiable, then it means that you are caught up in a situation where all the relevant evidence, right, is available to verify. So as you can see on the screen here, the ideal warranted assertability as put forward by Putnam 1983 simply tells us that X is true, right, if and only if X would be warrantedly assertable. And that's the issue of believing in what has been presented. So warrantedly assertable simply means believe, or it is believed. So ideal warranted assertability comes up if X, right, is true, right, and if and only if X would be warrantedly assertable, or it is believed in this case. So believed and warrantedly assertable means the same thing. And this is what we call the verification. So when you begin talking about verification theory of truth, you must be capable of verifying these particular things. And therefore, the truth that you are talking about, which is made up of X, right, that X, right, will only be true. And that is, those are really statements that we made, or the propositions X. X is true if and only if, yes, X is warrantedly assertable, or X is believed in this perspective in ideal conditions, ladies and gentlemen. And there are a number of objections, ladies and gentlemen, to such a view, right? Although, of course, our scholar Putnam in 1983 has advanced that kind of argument, I want to tell you that this argument also has flaws. The number of objections, and the most obvious is that we have no idea of what these epistemically ideal circumstances and of what the relevant evidence might be, and that we do not see how such beliefs could be justified if they were not true, ladies and gentlemen. So this view also leads to paradoxical consequences that must be addressed. But of course, Friedrich Fitch 1963 and Alvin Plantinga 1983 have attempted to come up with something that can certainly try to contribute to the debate in this direction. And as you can see, Fitch's argument, we are talking about Fitch 1963, Fitch's argument is the paradox of knowability. And the paradox of knowability simply says that if something is true, then it is at least knowable, even if it is de facto unknown. Right, so Fitch brings in that element that so if something is really true, then it is at least knowable, even if it is de facto unknown. Now, of course, Fitch continues to say that, moreover, it is possible that there are truths that are unknown. You all know that very well. If you're going to talk about verifiable or verification, or if you're going to verify certain truth, but there are those specific truths that are not known at all and will never be known, right? And these are called unknowable truths. But if something is an unknowable truth, ladies and gentlemen, then it is possible for it to be known, right, by our by something being known, ladies and gentlemen, which was our first condition in that perspective. So, in this kind of argument from Fitch, so we produce another condition, and we say that if something is known to be a knowable truth, then it is known to be a truth, because it is a knowable truth anyway. And therefore, that unknowableness, as you can see, it is known to be a truth. But if it is known to be a knowable truth, then it is a knowable truth, and hence it is not known, ladies and gentlemen. So it is impossible, as you can see, that there could be a truth that will never be known. Again, that's another perspective which we pick from Fitch in this case. And if there is a knowable truth, it will never be known to be such. Therefore, you cannot talk about truth because it is unknowable. So how does the bear how can that certainly bear on ideal verificationism? So in this case, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, so substitute in the previous argument believed to be true in ideal circumstances for truth. So in this case, we can substitute some of these words. And it follows, if something cannot be believed under ideal circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, it can never be believed that it is so in the ideal circumstances. So the biconditional expressing ideal warranted assertability above fails to be true when X, in this case, which is our proposition, right, is, right, X cannot be believed under ideal circumstances. So, but if we again bring another scholar at the fore, and that is Pratinga, and we take the Pratinga's argument, but I think in the interest of time, I will not really go into that, take that kind of aspect, but I will really ask you to go and read. But anyway, although I am not going to give you that detail, but I can say that Pratinga's argument attacks the claim that I've just given you, right, about the biconditional or bicondition expressing ideal warranted assertability above fails to be true when X is cannot be believed to be true under ideal circumstances. And according to Pratinga's argument, right, he attacks that kind of thinking, and of course he dismisses the aspect. And I'll ask you to go and read so that you understand exactly what is happening. Now, I am closing, and in closing, I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, remember we've been dealing with the verifications theory at this material time, in this lecture. In this, remember, earlier on we looked at the correspondence theory, and then right now we have discussed two theories, the coherence theory and the verification theory. So I am closing by saying that the difficulties that we see in these two theories, but more so the theory that we have just gone through, which is actually verification, right? Because remember, our beliefs can change, right? Again, you must have an ideal set of the right conditions so that you are able to relate A to B in that perspective. So, but anyways, you can see, as propounded by Pratinga, we have difficulties, right, in discussing these issues, again, as we see from the works of Putnam. And it is not really very easy for us to renounce the thesis that truth could be defined in ideal or be defined as ideal justification, and to retreat to the view that they are interdependent. So as with metaphysical coherentism, the definition actually presupposes the notion of truth as put forward by Putnam. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for attending this lecture 20. And in this lecture 20, we have discussed two theories, the coherence theory of truth and the verification theory. Join me again in our upcoming lecture, that is lecture 21, where we shall discuss the pragmatism theory and the identity theory. I want to thank you for attending. I wish you a nice time. Stay well and stay safe. Bye.